First, we will take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle the last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like an overripe fruit into our hands. Paraphrased and summarized, that in essence is the plan for world conquest outlined by Vladimir Lenin, father of Russian communism. No matter who the Kremlin boss has been, since Lenin's death in 1924, the communists have never deviated from this master plan, nor on the strategy necessary to carry it out. It is still their blueprint for conquest today. Complete world domination is the ultimate goal. The major target, the great prize, the United States of America. General Carlos Romulo, ambassador from the Philippines, past president of the United Nations General Assembly, sounded this urgent warning in a Reader's Digest feature article. America, wake up. The editors of the Reader's Digest commented,
"A wise and loyal friend of the United States warns us, the Cold War is a real war. It's far later than we know. The communists can win without changing their tactics. We cannot win without changing ours. We must assume the offensive. We dare not stand still."
To better understand this threat to our freedom, we will piece together many bits of recent history. This ideological warfare actually began November 7, 1917, when barely 8 months after the uprising that dethroned Tsar Nicholas II, Lenin and his Bolsheviks overthrew the first democratic government in Russian history. Terrorists' methods crushed all but sporadic resistance, and by 1922, the Reds controlled most of Russia. In that year, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formed by Lenin and his henchmen. Since then, bit by bit, the communists have steadily pushed toward their goal of world domination. They have used bribery, lies, bluff, brutality, the most extensive and most successful espionage network in world history, mass murder on a scale never before dreamed of, and every possible means to advance them along the road to world conquest, always guided by Lenin's blueprint. World War II proved to be an aid to Soviet ambitions for a world communist empire. Stalin made his notorious deal with Hitler in August of 1939, and the following month the German panzer divisions rolled into Poland. In just 4 weeks, Russia and Germany were cutting up Poland, dividing the spoils. The Reds moved next against tiny Finland. The Finns fought courageously, but Moscow got a toehold in the little Baltic nation. And soon thereafter, the Reds infiltrated Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, taking over the three little nations from within. The Baltic people resisted, not in an organized way, but individually. Hundreds of thousands of freedom-loving people were seized, thrown into cattle cars, and sped off to Siberian slave labor camps. The Soviet timetable for conquest was interrupted when Germany turned on the Kremlin and invaded Russia. As Germany drove deep into Russia, the vast numbers of Russian fighting men with American Lend-Lease aid proved a formidable obstacle. This, combined with our own bombing raids and ground strength, broke the German armies. But the on-rushing Allied forces were halted from going through eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans by a fateful decision of our government leaders. And the stage was set for Stalin's execution of the first phase of Lenin's master plan, the takeover of Eastern Europe. While maintaining the fiction of a coalition government, the communists gradually reorganized each state along Soviet lines and liquidated or discredited all organized opposition. Their task was made easier by the years of Nazi repression, which had weakened democratic groups. Non-communist parties lacked funds and the generous support that was forthcoming from Moscow for local communists. However, the supreme advantage enjoyed by the communists was the close proximity of the Red Army and the inaction of the Western nations. Arthur Bliss Lane resigned his post as ambassador to Poland and put on record in his book, I Saw Poland Betrayed, what he had witnessed of communist ruthlessness and the unaccountable apathy of American and British statesmen. Ambassador Lane wrote,
Our policy of appeasement toward Soviet Russia undoubtedly emboldened Stalin to go ahead with his plans for the complete domination of Poland, as of all other countries of Eastern Europe.
In 1947, Poland was forced into the growing family of satellites. A year later, while the West remained apparently oblivious, Czechoslovakia was added. Once the freest nation in Central Europe, Czechoslovakia was an ally of the West, and the Red Army had withdrawn in the fall of 1945. However, President Beneš was pressured into forming a provisional Government of the National Front, in which the key posts of ministries of Interior, Defense, Information, and Agriculture were held by communists or fellow travelers. On February 25, 1948, with the army, police, and all means of communication in communist hands, Beneš yielded to communist strongman Gottwald's ultimatum, and Czechoslovakia became a satellite of the Soviet Union. On March 10th, 2 weeks after the communists seized power, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk was found dead below the window of his office. An Associated Press Foreign Affairs editor wrote this memorable dispatch.
Jan Masaryk, although deeply devoted to democracy, thought he could do business with communism. His suicide is a monument to his recognition and a warning to the world that no such course is possible.
In September, at the age of 64, Edvard Beneš, president of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, was dead. Even the communists could not deny him a state funeral, and a tearful nation lined the streets of Prague to mourn the death of a man and a republic. So fell one by one the Eastern European nations, victims of Soviet infiltration, subversion, or force. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, until almost all of Eastern Europe had disappeared behind a curtain of iron. In Greece and Austria, where we acted to give real assistance to those who resisted, the Red advance was stalled, but they continued the drive for power in Western Europe. Where internal revolt has little chance of success, the Reds work to establish a so-called democratic socialist government where they can entrench themselves until the Communist Party takes over. John Strachey, a top official in the Labour Socialist Party of Great Britain, was for many years an openly avowed communist. In his book, The Theory and Practice of Socialism, he wrote,
It is impossible to establish communism as the immediate successor to capitalism. It is, accordingly, proposed to establish socialism as something which we can put in the place of our present decaying capitalism. Hence, communists work for the establishment of socialism as a necessary transition stage on the road to communism.
England has recently discovered the large extent of communist infiltration into her civil service. In France, the Communist Party is one of the largest single political parties. This is also true in Italy, where the communists made important gains in governmental power in 1962. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the Russian hammer and sickle covered the land, and the Soviets turned to the second step of Lenin's plan, the takeover of the masses of Asia. A powerful communist machine headed by Moscow-trained agents had long been entrenched in China. But it was the concessions gained by Stalin at the Yalta and Potsdam Conference, in the absence of Chiang Kai-shek, that opened the door to Soviet conquest. A worldwide communist propaganda campaign was initiated, picturing Mao Zedong as a great agrarian reformer and creating hate for Chiang Kai-shek. Agitation became widespread for a truce between the Communist Chinese and the nationalist armies. Pressure was brought for the cessation of U.S. military aid to nationalist China. In 1945, President Truman sent General George Marshall to urge Chiang Kai-shek to take the communists into a coalition government in China. Chiang refused. However, a temporary truce and an arms embargo were effected by General Marshall. Soon after the embargo went into effect, the Chinese Reds, supplied by the Russians with excellent equipment from Manchuria, moved into action again. This tragic turn of events in China raised questions by congressional leaders. And in the summer of 1947, General Albert C. Wedemeyer was sent to China to determine whether the United States should rescind its embargo and send supplies to Chiang's forces. Wedemeyer's report, withheld from Congress and the American public by presidential order, stated that with aid, the nationalist forces could prevent China's fall to the communists. It was 9 years after the communist takeover of China when General Wedemeyer's report was finally published. However, in 1949, the fall of China to the Reds aroused some political personages who spoke out critically. Among them, Congressman John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, who said, "Over these past few days, we have learned the extent of the disasters befalling China and the United States. Our policy in China has reaped the whirlwind. The continued insistence that aid would not be forthcoming unless a coalition government with the communists was formed was a crippling blow to the nationalist government." This statement was reported in the February 21st, 1949 Congressional Record. President Kennedy must not forget those words. A report on a subsequent investigation by the United States Senate read,
"The Judiciary Committee, in the report it has just issued, finds a conspiracy, communist-inspired, that led to American defeat. High American officials were duped. Policies were influenced that gave the communists their greatest victory."
In the years following the Chinese nationalists' defeat, the Reds have strengthened and consolidated their hold. Poor farmers who owned a few acres of land and objected to communist collectivization and the breakup of their families were liquidated. The dead, more than 20 million. The Chinese call it Seomei, which means deprived of existence. At the end of World War II, Soviet troops occupied North Korea to disarm surrendered Japanese forces. By 1948, the Soviet Union had created a new satellite out of North Korea. Over 2,000 Soviet Koreans, Communist Party members from Korean communities in Russian territory, had been placed in control of North Korea. Buttressing these political experts were Soviet and Chinese military advisors and 22,000 Korean troops trained by the Chinese army. On June 25, 1950, the communists launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea. American commanders who served in Korea during the fighting returned home bitter and deeply disturbed. To congressional committees, our commanding generals in Korea testified. Mark Clark said, "I was not allowed to bomb the numerous bridges that were across the Yalu River and over which the enemy constantly poured his trucks and his munitions and his killers." Stratemeyer, "You get in war to win it. You do not get in war to stand still and lose it, and we were required to lose it. We were not permitted to win." MacArthur stated, "Such a limitation upon the utilization of available military force to repel an enemy attack has no precedent either in our own history or, so far as I know, in the history of the world." It was a costly war. 54,264 Americans sacrificed their lives. Additional casualties numbered 103,284. A bitter price to pay for losing a war. This pattern of unprovoked aggression was continued by the Chinese Reds throughout Asia. In 1959, their Russian-supplied army overthrew the independent self-governing nation of Tibet. Persecution of the strongly anti-communist Buddhist priests inflamed the devout Tibetans to revolt. This was brutally suppressed by the Chinese Red Army. The religious leader, the Dalai Lama, and thousands of his devoted followers fled to sanctuary in India rather than submit to communist tyranny. To the southeast of Tibet, in Vietnam, the communist Ho Chi Minh masqueraded as leader of the Vietnamese nationalist movement. The French agreed to recognition of the new state, and Ho pledged them his loyal cooperation. However, within 2 months, Ho's forces launched a surprise attack on the French and plunged Vietnam into a war that has cost more than 60,000 casualties and left over 2 million homeless. By 1962, the United States was deeply involved as the struggle spread to South Vietnam. In neighboring Laos, U.S.-trained and equipped Laotian troops have fought a 10-year shadow war against Viet Minh communist invaders. Important as a military backdoor, Laos is the gateway to Thailand and Burma and conquest of Southeast Asia. International communism has a heavy stake in each of these invasions. The 600 million people of communist China are desperately in need of food, and Mao's forced industrialization program is badly in need of raw materials. In Indonesia, communist-supported President Sukarno threatens and reaches for more territory at the expense of the Dutch in New Guinea. International communism has established important beachheads, not only in Europe and Asia, but also in the Middle East and Africa. In nearly every part of the world, they have instigated nationalistic revolts, student riots, assassinations, political unrest, and civil strife. The extent of infiltration and subversion by Kremlin agents in Latin America has been demonstrated in Mexico, El Salvador, Chile, Ecuador, Guatemala, Venezuela, as well as other Latin American countries. Early in 1948, Bogota, Colombia was the scene of a significant demonstration of communism in action. Dr. George Gaitan, popular liberal leader and idol of the Colombian masses, was assassinated in an attempt to disrupt the 1948 Inter-American Conference and discredit the Colombian government. A well-plotted uprising was touched off by Red agents. They claimed that the Colombian president was responsible for Gaitan's death. Communist-led workers and students seized Bogota radio stations and attacked the Palace of Justice. In all, more than 136 buildings worth over $21 million were destroyed before police subdued the mob. The Colombian National Police have in their files evidence and testimony linking Fidel Castro with the Bogota assassination and riots, and identifying him as a communist agent. Yet warnings as early as 1958 that Fidel Castro was a communist, or a long-time willing tool of world communism, fell on deaf ears in the United States. Instead, leading American news media jumped blindly on the Castro bandwagon, portraying him as a romantic rebel, a Robin Hood, leading a fight for social justice. The pro-Castro atmosphere that resulted brought about withdrawal of military aid to the anti-communist Batista government. Again, as with the fall of China, the United States ordered an embargo at a crucial point in the Cuban revolt. However, Castro's agents in Florida were able to obtain great volumes of fighting equipment, purchased mostly with communist-supplied funds. Millions of dollars from Russian and Chinese subsidies were channeled through secret groups in several Latin American countries. Nathaniel Weil's well-documented book, Red Star Over Cuba, gives details of this, including the quote from Stanley Ross, editor of El Diario de Nueva York, who wrote that Castro bought entire regiments from Batista's officers and on one occasion purchased for $650,000 cash an entire armored train complete with tanks, guns, ammunition, jeeps, and 600 men. With the fall of the Batista government to Castro's shaggy band of revolutionaries on January 1st, 1959, the first completely communist government in the Western Hemisphere was established. To escape the brutal communization of their country, thousands of Cubans have fled to the United States by every possible means. In a 5-hour speech broadcast by Havana Radio on December 2nd, 1961, Fidel Castro removed all doubt when he announced that he had been a communist since his student days at the University of Havana. Nikita Khrushchev welcomed him to the communist ranks and declared, "We must stir up fires where we can. Cuba we have helped and shall help further without fear. The United States did not interfere in Cuba." Thus, Lenin's heirs to the dictatorship of world communism had begun the third and final phase of the master plan, the encirclement of the United States. In the United States, only 90 miles from Cuba, activities of communist agents who called themselves Americans have made headlines. Alger Hiss, who had the confidence of an American president and access to vital secrets. Harry Dexter White, a key man in the U.S. Treasury. Judith Copeland, working amazingly enough in the Justice Department itself. Vernon Mitchell and William Martin, employees of the National Security Administration, who suddenly disappeared with valuable secret information. They turned up in Mexico, then Cuba, then Moscow. Captain Joseph E. Kaufman of the United States Air Force in Europe, convicted of espionage for the Soviets in 1962. This is only a partial list of Americans who have betrayed their country to communism. Here in San Francisco, USA, American university students riot against the House Committee on Un-American Activities. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover issued this special report over his signature. In his report, Mr. Hoover shows how known communist agents infiltrated campuses in the San Francisco area, promoting and inciting more than 1,000 students to riot against the House Committee, which for over 20 years has investigated and exposed communist activities in America. Mr. Hoover also revealed that Gus Hall, national leader of the Communist Party USA, sent congratulations to the West Coast comrades for the initiative and leadership they displayed at all stages of the demonstration. In conclusion, Mr. Hoover issued a sober warning to the people of America. In looking at the riots and chaos communists have created in other countries, many Americans point to the strength of our nation and say, it can't happen here. The communist success in San Francisco in May 1960 proves that it can happen here. The FBI has investigated the enemy at work in all areas of our national life. Congressional committees have documented the fact that communists have penetrated a number of labor unions, communications networks, areas of education, some church organizations, our federal government, our legislative halls, our armed services. These agents are dedicated, highly trained, and secretly working for the overthrow of our nation and the triumph of world communism. By 1950, the first phase of the master plan had brought 116 million people in Eastern Europe under communist domination. In Asia, the second phase has already added 700 million, and activity in Southeast Asia has been intensified by the communists. And now, with the acknowledged communization of Cuba and increasing red penetration in Latin America, a giant step has been taken toward the complete encirclement of America. The communists will allow nothing and no one to stand in their way. Recently, 67-year-old Nikita Khrushchev ranted, "I want to see the red flag flying over the entire world in my lifetime." Khrushchev alternately blows hot then cold about Berlin, creating a crisis when it suits his needs, using the pressure as a wedge to divide the NATO powers, or simply to divert attention from a furtive grab for power in another part of the world. In order to provide the tanks and troops, the money for espionage, propaganda, and subversion, Khrushchev keeps the inhabitants of Russia and its satellites at a bare subsistence level. Terror and intimidation prevent the people from expressing their resentment against a regime which promises so much but gives so little. 67% of the women and the children over 14 are in the labor force. The average Russian's personal income is less than $10 a week in terms of purchasing power. Khrushchev rules a nation where only 4% of the population have any voice in the government, and most of those have only the right to applaud. In his callous climb to power, Khrushchev has been responsible for the suffering and death of millions. The crimes of Khrushchev have been verified by congressional committee witnesses who testified under oath and documented their charges with data and photographs smuggled out of Russia. Among the crimes they charged were 30 years ago, as secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Khrushchev directed the deliberate starvation of Ukrainian peasants who rebelled against forced collectivization of their land. An estimated 6 to 7 million innocent men, women, and children died as a result of this man-made famine. In 1945, Khrushchev supervised the mass arrests of priests and bishops in the Ukraine. At that time, there were 4,400 Catholic churches, 127 monasteries. Today, there are none. In 1956, the Soviet dictator sent Russian tanks and troops to slaughter the Hungarian students and workers who wanted freedom from communist tyranny. Students suspected of sympathy or participation in the revolt were sent to labor camps in Russia. In spite of this massive documentation and warnings from informed sources, there are many Americans today who will not believe the terrible truth about this man who holds supreme power over the Soviet Empire. World communist leaders gathering in Moscow in 1961 for the 22nd Communist Party Congress We're told by Khrushchev that the United States has entered a phase of mounting difficulties and crises, the phase of its decline. The victory of socialism on a world scale is no longer far off. Will this fantastic prediction come true? We are a nation of 186 million people, many of whom are totally uninformed or apathetic toward the true nature of this grave problem. We have become a nation in which the responsibilities of citizenship are being ignored. We are encircled by international communism, and the enemy is in our midst. They advocate so-called peace fronts and preach coexistence while working to destroy faith in America's constitutional government and the benefits of private enterprise. We can halt and ultimately destroy the communist master plan for conquest if our people and our leaders have the courage and the will to win this Cold War. We must support our government by being well informed and by taking an active part in government. We must enforce the legal safeguards which enable our government to deal effectively with communist fifth column activities which have penetrated the vitals of our nation. We must stiffen our citizens' and our nation's diplomatic attitude toward the entire communist international conspiracy and the brutal despots leading it. We must arouse our friends and neighbors to a better understanding of the value of personal freedom and to the importance of keeping government close to the people. We must take a clear look at our moral weakening. In our churches, our schools, our homes, we must build the caliber of leadership that a free people must have in order to remain free. It is too late for continued apathy. We must realize the true meaning of patriotism, as did such heroic Americans as Nathan Hale, who chose death instead of tyranny with the proud words, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Since our nation was founded, Americans have not faltered when our country was in danger. From the farmers at Lexington and Concord, the frontiersmen at the Alamo, the valiant doughboys who sleep in Flanders, and the Marines on Iwo Jima, Americans have paid the ultimate price for our freedom. This war against communism is your war. At this crucial moment of human history, will you enlist and pledge a part of your mental, physical, material, and spiritual resources in this fight? On the manner in which Americans respond to this challenge rests the future hope of all free men. This is the Iron Curtain, a wall of concrete, iron, and steel that separates the free world from the Kremlin's slave empire. Shrouded in ominous silence are the barbed wire and electric fences, guard towers and minefields, armed patrols, and floodlighted entanglements that span the perimeter of every communist-dominated frontier. It starts at the Arctic Ocean. Moving southward, it then skirts the Soviet coastline along the Baltic. It seals off Poland, then cuts through the heart of Germany and envelops the captive nations of East Central Europe. Turning eastward, it continues through Asia to Red China and its hungry millions. This 11,000-mile border encircles 15 million square miles, 1/4 of the world's land surface. Behind the heavily patrolled boundaries live 1 billion people, captives of the communist empire. The communists had claimed everyone was happy in the workers' paradise and the Iron Curtain was only for defense. But in the divided city of Berlin, the real truth was there for all the world to see. Escapers from communism spoke of miserable living conditions, incessant economic pressures, and the constant fear of prison, deportation, or death. In all, over 12 million have fled communist oppression.
From East Germany alone, an estimated 3.5 million have fled to the West. Of these, the majority were skilled workers and farmers. 1/2 were young people under 25 who sought freedom in spite of the years of communist indoctrination. Many were substantial self-employed business and professional men escaping with their families. This continuous flow created an acute labor shortage at all levels in East Germany and proved the claim of contentment in the People's Republic a lie.
To halt this loss, the notorious Berlin Wall was constructed. This was in violation of the Four Power Agreements. Windows and doors were bricked up, and every escape route along the 30-mile border was sealed off. Families and friends were forcibly separated. 73 crossing points were closed. Only 7 remained as points of entry, and East German guards closely checked all identification. Desperate and ingenious escape methods were devised. This reinforced truck plowed head-on through the Berlin Wall. Others have tunneled under it. More than 6,000 people have managed to escape since the wall was built. This defecting airman took an easy route over the Iron Curtain. But for most Russians, there is seldom an opportunity to escape. Few but the trusted elite are allowed travel permits. And even with them, contact with the free world produces disillusionment with communism.
In New York, an example of this occurred at the Soviet consulate. A teacher of the consulate officials' children, Madame Oksana Kasenkina, jumped from a third-story window rather than return to Russia. Seriously injured, she was rescued by New York police and given sanctuary in America.
More recently, Rudolf Nureyev, one of the artistic elite, made a sudden bid for freedom and won. The leading male dancer of Leningrad's Kirov Opera Company, Nureyev is now winning new laurels in the West as the star of a French ballet company. Viktor Janomets, a member of the hand-picked crew on Khrushchev's yacht, slipped away to safety during the dictator's UN visit. Also, members of a privileged class were the more than 11,000 East German soldiers and people's police who have defected to the West. The grim face of communism turns their eyes to the freedom beyond the barricade. Leaving everything behind, this young border guard suddenly leaped across the red barrier to the free world. But other members of the People's Police dutifully prevent escapes. They shoot to kill. West Berliners placed this cross near the wall. Translated, it says, "Driven to death by Vopos. Bernd Lunzer died for his freedom."
How does communism exist if it is so intolerable to the people it rules?
The means of Soviet control must be examined in order to answer that question. Highest official body of the entire Communist Party is the Presidium. The obedient servant of the Soviet dictator, the Presidium's decisions are implemented by the Communist Party and its leaders in each communist-dominated country. These puppets set in motion the huge bureaucracy of communism, which plans and controls the economic activity of the Soviet Union, as well as its colonial empire. The secret police, with its vast network of agents and informers, is a constant deterrent to anyone wanting to break a regime's established pattern. The Red Army poses an enormous threat to opposition beyond the capacity of the secret police. Some of communism's easiest conquests were made in the years following World War II. Aided by the enormous destruction and social chaos in many countries at the war's end. Since that time, tactics based on infiltration and subversion have proven successful in many parts of the world. Kremlin agents capitalize on governmental weaknesses and the aspirations of underdeveloped areas. The poor and gullible are incited to revolt with glowing promises of a better life for all who follow the red banner. Behind a facade of phony people's democracy, democratic leaders are purged. These 2 East Germans were executed because they opposed the communist regime.
In Katyn Forest were found the bodies of 4,000 of 15,000 missing Polish officers who were Russian prisoners of war. Because they were potential leaders of opposition in post-war Poland, these helpless captives were liquidated by the communists. 11,000 are yet to be found.
Near Hamhong, Korea, 300 South Korean peasant leaders were sealed up alive in caves by the invading North Koreans. Anticipating total conquest of Korea, the communists had begun their methodical elimination of all people likely to head a revolt. After the invaders were pushed northward by the UN forces, weeping relatives searched the long rows of dead for husbands, brothers, and sons. In every country being subjugated, mass executions are carried out by the communists to terrorize the population into obedience. Terror and tyranny are the basis of communist control. When all democratic leaders have been removed, a new class with a strong vested interest in the Red regime is then created. It often includes criminals released by invading Russians. The convictions of these thugs range from petty theft to murder. They were appointed by the Russians as government officials and functionaries, some as members of the secret police. Once communist control is established, newspapers and magazines are rigidly censored and print articles that are inventions of the propagandists with little relation to facts. Innocent classics and books by approved communist authors are the only ones allowed in libraries and bookstores. Communist-controlled mass media spreads the party line throughout the country. The people are told what the regime demands of them. Religious services and church activities are closely regulated as a prelude to religious persecution. Protesting clergymen are arrested or transferred to remote parts of the country. It is mostly the old who cling to their religion, for the young are taught atheistic beliefs. Worship of God is replaced by worship of Lenin. Outside his huge concrete mausoleum in Red Square, hundreds of the party faithful wait patiently to worship at the communist shrine. Vladimir Lenin, the messiah of international communism, has been dead for almost 40 years, but his satanic message lives on.
Let me teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted.
From state-operated nursery on, each child is pumped full of hate with red lies and godless doctrines. The USSR Teacher's Gazette boldly declares that the Soviet teacher, and we quote, is obliged not only to be an unbeliever himself, but also to be an active propagandist of godlessness among others.
Upper grades consist primarily of vocational training. The only students permitted to get a higher education are those whose parents are influential party members or those found reliable by communist standards.
Universities and colleges are open only to those who can procure a certificate of political reliability. From kindergarten to college, communists work to destroy religious influences and parental authority. Children are turned against their parents and taught to be state informers.
A Ural peasant, the father of 12-year-old Pavlik Morozov, was one of many victims of this vicious indoctrination. In order to feed his family, the elder Morozov withheld from the state food collectors a small portion of grain. Denounced by his young son, he was sentenced to 10 years of forced labor.
For this deed, Pavlik, the informer, is the exalted ideal for communist youth. Family life is further undermined by low incomes that force women and children to work, and by crowded living conditions, since all construction and housing is state-controlled.
In an American city, the average family of 4 has almost 1,400 square feet of living space.
In a Soviet city, an average family of 4 is permitted a living area that measures about 12 by 13 feet. 3 families would be sharing one outmoded kitchen in their state-owned dwelling. For 12 people, there would be 1 water faucet. The use of 3 electrical outlets would be shared by these 12 people. The Russians use this picture in a propaganda magazine to show Americans the excellence of their housing. Even though shoddy and unattractive by American standards, this apartment is a much sought prize in the Soviet Union. Inadequate living conditions are a result of the Kremlin's demands for increased production of munitions and heavy industry. This, in turn, is hampered by inefficient methods dictated by the party. The state-managed steel mills of the Soviet Union, even though working at full capacity, only produced about 72 million tons annually.
At only partial operating capacity, the American steel industry's annual production was almost 100 million tons.
This graph shows the result of the emphasis on heavy industry in Russia. In 1913, before communism, consumer goods represented 2/3 of all production. By 1955, under communist rule, the percentage of consumer goods had slumped to less than 1/3 of total production. In the Soviet Union and its satellites, each shop and factory has a quota system. If a worker or his group falls short of the quota set by the efficiency experts, his pay is docked. These red-style efficiency experts are usually reliable communists whose political careers depend on pushing the quotas higher and higher.
Rarely will a worker in this Soviet automobile factory be able to own what he makes. Most of the 1/2 million cars and trucks produced per year are destined for use by the military or party functionaries. Few are privately owned. Any American worker can own one of the nearly 7 million automobiles manufactured in the United States each year.
Yet the average worker under a Kremlin-style government must work longer today to buy most necessities than he did before communism. As an example, let's take the simple necessity, a loaf of bread. In Poland in 1938, before communism, 10 minutes of a man's labor paid for a loaf of bread. In 1957, under the communist regime, it took exactly twice that long, 20 minutes. This was true in all the Iron Curtain countries. In Romania before, 14 minutes. After, 19 minutes. Latvia before, 8 minutes. After, 20 minutes. Double and more. In Poland, before the communists took over, it required 40 hours of a man's work to buy a pair of shoes. But in 1957, 12 years after the takeover, the figure was 97 hours. In Romania, before, 45 hours. After, 77 hours. In Latvia, 17 hours before. Under communism, 125 hours.
An American works 6 hours and 40 minutes for a pair of men's leather shoes. In the Soviet Union, after 45 years of communist rule, it takes 29 hours of a man's labor to pay for a pair of work shoes.
A file is kept on each person at his place of work. This comprehensive political and personal record is begun with the first year of school. It is kept up to date with details gained from informers and from repeated interviews with the worker and his associates. A similar file at secret police headquarters holds absolute control over the existence of each individual. The low wages paid the average worker by the state are reduced even further by hidden taxes and numerous deductions. Enforced enrollment for peace loans and 5-year plan loans take 5 to 10% of a worker's earnings. There are no strikes in the workers' paradise, not because the workers are satisfied, but because they are deprived by law of all right to strike. The communists work at presenting a facade of democracy. This is an election in communist Poland. The people are required to vote. However, there is only a single list of candidates featuring the names of communists and communist puppets. The ballot is marked and put in the ballot box under the watchful eye of the party official. The only means of protest is revolt. Soviet tanks moved against East Berlin workers who were shouting for bread and freedom. After this revolt, 50,000 East Germans were imprisoned. A similar revolt in Hungary went much farther. A genuinely spontaneous uprising, the Hungarian freedom fighters were drawn from the ranks of workers, students, peasants, business, and professional people. Their few glorious but fearful days of freedom were ended when Khrushchev sent in 5,000 tanks and 200,000 Soviet troops. To examine communist justice, we can move closer to home, to Cuba, only 90 miles off the Florida coast. Soon after he came to power, Fidel Castro held show trials of Batista followers. In a circus atmosphere, wild accusations were encouraged. Hundreds were executed. Then came the trials of disillusioned ex-revolutionaries. Critical of the direction the revolution had taken, 300,000 were imprisoned and others executed. Judgments were made on a political basis. There is a precedent for this, of course, in communist justice.
The Czechoslovak Minister of National Security stated in 1952, "The question as to who is guilty and who is innocent will in the end be decided by the party with the help of the national security organs."
In a January 1961 issue of U.S. News and World Report, Dr. Emilio Menendez, Cuba's former Chief Justice, who resigned his position in 1960 and took refuge in the United States, declared in a copyrighted interview that Cuba no longer is a state of law. Rather, the will of the government is the law. Any policeman or Army intelligence soldier can enter your home, take you to jail, search your home, and you never know why. Just all of a sudden, one day, you find yourself before a revolutionary court made up of soldiers. Most of these soldiers have no experience in law at all. As Castro's regime floundered and food became scarce, Castro instituted strict rationing of Cuba's rapidly diminishing food supply. Added to this was a reign of terror against the farmers in an attempt to force higher output. But Castro wasn't alone with his agricultural problems. Hunger and starvation was on the march in Red China, Russia, and her satellites. After 40 years of collectivization and relentless agricultural planning, Russia's state-owned farms lagged behind pre-war production. Farmers on these enormous state-owned farms are hired hands. Those on collectives are sharecroppers.
The Soviet farmer produces only enough to feed himself and 4 other people. By comparison, an American farmer produces enough to feed himself and 26 other people.
Only on the tiny private plots allotted to these once independent farmers can individual enterprise and ingenuity be exercised. These little gardens, which make up only 4% of the tilled land, produce half of the milk, meat, and vegetables, 80% of the eggs, and more than 60% of the potatoes consumed by the Russian people. A rebuke to the whole system of socialized agriculture. The Russian farmer did not give up his independence willingly. In fact, Stalin admitted to Churchill that collectivization had cost more lives than World War II.
In the Ukraine alone, more than 6 million peasants who resisted collectivization had been forcibly starved to death.
Even in the satellites, the costly failure of collectivization was apparent. 1961's total harvest in Eastern Europe was scarcely better than pre-war production in the same area. Significantly, the best yield was in Poland, where some 86% of the land is now privately owned and worked. But if farm output was bad in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Cuba, it was catastrophic in Red China. Mao Zedong, in planning the Chinese economy, had favored industry with a huge percentage of the nation's capital investment, but allowing only 8% to agriculture. The gross industrial product increased greatly, but farm production rose scarcely enough to feed the population growth. After several preliminary stages, including the dispossession of large landowners, the Chinese Reds forced complete collectivization and eliminated even the smallest private ownership of land. 20 million who objected were executed. Their deaths served as a warning to others with similar ideas. The communes introduced military concepts into farming with cadres or kanpus who carried out Beiping's policies. China's 100 million peasant families were broken up. Children became wards of the Beiping government and were placed in state-operated nurseries or schools where education and training were directed by the Red regime. Husbands and wives were assigned to separate barracks and mess halls. From 24,000 Spartan communes, the peasants were routed from bed at dawn and marched off to the fields. At the sound of the Kanbu's whistle, they seized rifles for close order drill. At another signal, they hurried to their tasks of plowing, weeding, planting, or reaping. Ignorance, mismanagement, and loss of all personal incentive produced a nationwide famine. China's total grain harvest in 1961 was less than in 1957, and there were 60 million more Chinese to be fed. The food ration was cut to a little more than 1,000 calories a day. In the West, 2,000 calories a day are considered the minimum for office work.
Even in once fertile Shantung province, so many were dying of starvation that they were being buried in mass graves, reported to Red Chinese pilots who defected.
In the countries scarred by hammer and sickle, hunger was on the march. Attempts were made to blame communism's agricultural failures on old mistakes of Stalin, and even on the hostility of the capitalistic West. The communists could no longer shift the blame to the upper classes. They had been eliminated under communism. Workers were promised a classless society, equal income, control of the government and the economy. Yet today, Soviet incomes are grossly unequal within a new hierarchy of classes.
The dictator has replaced the Tsar.
Next to him is the new royal family, the Secretariat, consisting of never more than 25 people with unlimited incomes and privileges. Next in line is the royal officialdom of the party elite and the most important artists and scientists. They represent 1/10,000th of 1% of the Russian people. Each receives a monthly income of $20,000, in addition to special stores, cars, yachts, and other privileges. Next are the top officials, the aristocratic echelon composed of top bureaucrats, generals, industrial managers, important artists and scientists.
They represent 1.5% of the population, and monthly incomes are equivalent to about $2,500. They also get special privileges of stores, cars, and villas.
The bureaucrats are the minor aristocracy, civil servants, party bureaucracy, professionals, Stakhanovite workers.
This 15.5% of the Soviet people are paid a monthly income of approximately $400.
Peasants and workers are still next to the bottom of the ladder.
Representing 80% of the population, their monthly income equals about $160.
At the bottom of this monolithic structure are the forced laborers. 3% of Russia's over 200 million work at a starvation level.
The map of the Red Empire is dotted with the locations of forced labor camps. Each country that has fallen to communist tyranny has supplied its share of the 20 million slave laborers that became part of the Soviet economy.
While the economic importance of the slave camps is slight when compared with their value as links in the chain of terror that holds together the empire. Lie, treachery, torture, slavery, and murder are used deliberately to gain communist ends. Mute testimony to communist inhumanity is offered by the graves of millions of victims of the Red March to world conquest. The peasants of the Ukraine, murdered by deliberate starvation. The massacred citizens of Latvia. The slaughtered Polish prisoners in Katyn Forest. The bullet-riddled bodies of Chinese who failed to conform. The South Korean villagers callously buried alive. The victims of Castro's bloodbath in Cuba. Is it any wonder that millions have sought to escape this tyranny? Even though they risk death, materialistic communism has failed to provide even the basic necessities of life for its people. The drab reality of hunger and scarcity of consumer goods has revealed the glittering promises of communism as fraudulent. Still, Khrushchev brazenly declares that communism will take over the United States from within. He boasts of a 1973 deadline for the downfall of the United States. Today, we and all the free world are faced with the dangerous consequences of Soviet and Red Chinese failures. Desperate measures are needed by the Red overlords to shift attention from communism's bankruptcy. more acute their crisis, the greater our danger from their aggression. We must awake to this threat before it is too late. We should have confidence in America's industrial might and agricultural wealth. These are the products of free men working together in one nation under God. America's liberty has been purchased with the blood and sacrifices of its patriots, whose ideals have made our country the refuge and symbol of hope for the oppressed peoples of the world. We must understand the source of our great strength in order to preserve the ideals which have nurtured it. Freedom can only exist where the will and determination of the people are strong enough to preserve this precious heritage.